Hello, everyone, and welcome back from your brief afternoon break. Hopefully you got yourself situated, did a few jumping jacks if you need to keep yourself moving after lunch. I am Jessica Smith, once again here with Minnie Bredouw. She will be doing the breakout session, designing our building capacity for inclusion. If you would like to be participating with your video and audio and chat, we would love to encourage you to do so. Please follow the directions on screen to join us in the interactive Zoom room. And Minnie will be doing a brief summary of her keynote and then really diving into the measurement and capacity building around designing for inclusion. Why don't I turn it over to you, Minnie, and you can take it away, and we'll kind of monitor folks joining us in the interactive version over the next few minutes.
All right. I don't see anyone in the room yet, Nick or Jess. I'm not sure if folks have joined. Just to be clear on that. Do you know if there's anyone in the...
I too am not seeing whether folks are joining.
Nobody in just yet, but it might take a couple seconds for people to sign in and everything else like that. So hopefully we'll get some people here soon.
I think we should wait just because because effectively, like, the workshop is actually a lot of working time and a lot of sharing. So that will be a priority for us.
Okay, we shall wait then. This Nick helps direct people. Oh, I see some folks sharing info in the chat. So hopefully folks will join as they can for this this breakout and designing.
Great.
It sounds like some folks may be just having some technology confusion around the scheduling and accessing.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just walk everyone through it too. The way historically I've done the workshop is people are doing it and sharing back, and we're kind of learning and discussing from one another. So yeah, so as soon as we see, 35 folks kind of in the room, I think that's enough to jump in. But.
Okay, I'll keep an eye, and then I can remind folks about having something to take notes, and I can also do another repeat introduction.
Okay, and should people just pop up? Like, I think Nick said they would just pop up in the
I believe so. Yeah, because I'm getting a bunch of messages about how do I get in there. So I'm wondering, Nick and attendees, please either check your chat description for the access information for Minnie Bredouw's breakout session. It was recently posted by the UW-Will team to join that Zoom meeting. I'm also wondering if Nick has the opportunity, he may be able to flash that on the screen for the main video. Mm-hmm. So that you can follow the instructions and join us in Minnie's breakout session if that is the session that you are hoping to attend this afternoon. We're giving you a couple of minutes as we're all figuring out and navigating the technology so that we don't miss the design opportunity and creative discussions with Minnie. Let's see. So thank you for your patience, Minnie. It looks like I'm getting messages that people would like to join. So I think we just need to let the technology
all good.
Catch up.
Stand by, no problem.
Thank you. Excellent.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
Hello.
Waiting for folks
welcome.
To join.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we are allowing some folks to attend our breakout so that we can have an interactive conversation. Minnie, for full disclosure, right now this looks like two of our city colleagues and leaders and visionaries and inclusive practices and employment. So we shall be having a good conversation.
Excellent.
At least amongst the few of us that have chosen to disclose our participation. Some folks, I'm not sure if they're able to also watch live. So why don't I allow us to continue on then. For folks, if you'd like to be participating, Minnie has recommended some, pen and paper, sticky notes, your notes app, whatever it is that you would use to be able to kind of take notes and participate in the conversation with her this afternoon. So as a reminder, this is Inclusive Capacity Building with Minnie Bredouw. And this is our breakout session this afternoon.
Excellent. All right, I'll happily take it away. Welcome everyone. I know that it's been a busy day and I'm happy to hopefully make some of the things that I just did a keynote about what sort of in designing inclusion entails, and now is really the opportunity to apply some of the learnings and think about ways that we can kind of build our own capacity within our respective organizations. So I'm going to screen share here again. Give me 1 minute. This is an interactive session, so if you don't have pen and paper already, grab some of that materials, and what we will be doing just to set expectations and kind of frame the context is going through a series of processes and activities to really help us think about inclusion from sort of a business lens, and then sharing back with one another. So again, there is an interactive component to what we're doing today. So I'll just jump right in. One of the things that just to give a bit of context for anyone who wasn't in the keynote, my name is Minnie. I run a nonprofit called Purpose Project, which is incubated out of a global innovation firm, IDEO. We focus on using the process of sort of innovation and creative problem solving to think about creating systemic change in the context of a range of industries. And so my focus lands in the education space. I focus on social emotional learning for youth and young adults. I'm focused primarily on how do we serve youth furthest from opportunity? How do we help create a sense of advocacy and agency for young people in today's climate. So I'll be really hoping that we can spend some time talking critically about what are some approaches and tools that we can all be thinking about in our respective orgs. And without further ado, I'll just dive right in. Please chat if there's any questions or thoughts. So to summarize, what I shared in the keynote just was a little primer and definition of what inclusive design actually is. So a couple things to highlight here. Inclusive design is a proactive and ongoing process of designing products and services, policies, infrastructure, systems, really fill in the blank there. And for and with communities that are historically underrepresented. This could be really anyone on the different vectors of and dimensions of diversity. But ultimately, I think the imperative thing here is with. How are we actually working with a broad range of stakeholders to help inform our thinking and our processes? And again, just to kind of reiterate, all of us are designers, right? We're designing campaigns, products, infrastructure, services. Like, no matter who you are, you're designing something. And so I would love for everyone, as we're thinking about this work today, to ask themselves, what is it that I'm designing? And how am I contributing to creating an inclusive environment for the people that are my end beneficiaries? And kind of a note on the way in which we've historically kind of designed our systems in the United States of America. We do tend to kind of have this filter of a bit of an individual, we are an individualistic society. And so often the way that we have kind of looked at innovation and design over the past 200 years is on the left, it's currently optimized for individuals, for present, here and now. Generally wisdom of a few people who kind of hold the power and hold the knowledge and efficiency. And a lot of this is rooted in kind of where we began our innovation and design in the Industrial Revolution, and haven't really looked back since in terms of how we tend to innovate. And so the provocation I have for sort of today and this sort of broader system of how we can be thinking about innovation is, how do we learn to optimize for communities rather than individuals? How do we learn to optimize for the past, present, and the future, and think about where we've been and where we're going as key indicators of kind of where we are in the here and now? How do we start to optimize for wisdom of everybody? And instead of just looking at kind of the key stakeholders or individuals who are kind of running or orienting the business needs, how are we starting to include a broader range of voices to inform our priorities? And how do we optimize for impact? So these are just some provocations for all of us to think about when we really look at innovation and design at large, and what it means. Inclusion is not just a product or a service, it's actually thinking about how we do this work as much as anything. A little context on design, as we're going to be spending some time like redesigning our own systems today. Historically, we start with research and getting to know and understand the communities within which we're looking to better serve. Then we move into a phase of sort of designing and building and thinking and tinkering and making, and then there's implementation. And in theory, this should map to any process. It's not just the plight of a product designer or somebody who's working in the world of Silicon Valley, but it really is kind of anything that you make should in some way, shape, or form have these three phases involved. What I try to layer on top of that for my students who I work with and my clients as well is that there's a lot of pieces that are going into this process that may go unseen. So things like looking at privilege or the history and healing of different communities that may be within our own community or outside of the community we're a part of. Understanding ethics and understanding and learning about new cultures that may be our own or may be outside of our own. Looking at bias, building a participatory process when we design. So looking at ways to actually bring in a range of voices and communities. And in that process, building the capacity. If I was on a screen, I would be pointing to these. So hopefully it's easy enough to follow along. How are we building capacity with the communities that we're looking to serve? And then most importantly, how are we looking at the whole system and creating a theory of change and measuring that impact? It's not enough to have a product or a service that we feel is an improved version of what it was before, but actually saying, here's where we've come and here's where we have to go. And I talked a bit about that in my keynote as well around thinking about the long-term impact of what we make and acknowledging your growth mindset. So this is just a quick summary of the 6 key points that I made in the keynote, and I'm just going to recap them for anyone who wasn't able to join that earlier session. And the 6 things that I encourage folks to be practicing and applying to their own work when they're thinking about innovation and design in the context of inclusion or serving communities. In the case of UWL, which is really thinking about the disabled community, is recognizing exclusion and how that exists, understanding our unconscious bias, designing with and not for, solving for one but extending to many, considering the opposite, which is effectively what could be the negative effects of what I make and how will I mitigate those risks, and embracing a growth mindset. And so what we're going to do in this workshop is actually start to apply some of the ways in which we can focus on this within our own organization, and all of this will be interactive. So again, if you have pen and paper, some way to write, some way to take notes, that would be great. All right, cool. So let's dive in. So the first thing I encourage everyone to do, and I think that many of us who have a background in trauma-informed care and an experience in doing social work may have some experience similar to this, but this is a framework that I use that I find to be very helpful, is looking at lenses. And as I framed in the keynote, foundational to contributing to the world as a problem solver is asking yourself, who am I? And how does that shape what I value or perceive as important or relevant to building an inclusive capacity within my respective org? So in the context that I work in, which is referred to as human-centered design, designing with the human or the human need at the center, we often make designers out to seem like they're objective parties, right? Like doing the research, synthesizing, designing solutions, but identity plays a large role in that. And the intersectionality of our identity with other identities can be a really important angle for us to look kind of more deeply at. And so I encourage everyone to ask, what are our unique lenses? And I'd love to many of you may have done something similar to this, but this is hopefully a tool that you can use with folks that you will continue to be working with to evangelize this type of thinking. So, and the reason we look at our lenses, of course, is that it informs biases, and biases, when we don't address them on the nose, can actually end up becoming something that can evolve into some pretty negative sort of systemic problems. And so this is something that we can do to get ahead of that kind of growth of an evolution of bias. So I would love everyone to grab your pen and paper or whatever you're using your writing with, and we're going to do a short exercise focused on unpacking our lenses and how they affect our perception of what's important. So you can make 3 columns on the paper. I'll do it as well. So I'm like timing. I'll time it against my my time as well. And on the first one is going to be your inherited lenses. So things that are a part of you, you inherited pretty much the minute you were born. Then we'll have the second column. In fact, I'll sketch these out so everyone can see. And then in the second column, we'll have developed lenses. So things that have developed over time. So possibly places you've spent time or lived. And then the third is we'll talk about cultural lenses. So things that you believe based on something to do with, perhaps that would be a political view or a cause you care about. And then once we have a few minutes to actually write those 3 areas down, we'll take a second to actually ask, what are some values I hold because of my inherited, developed, and cultural lenses? And so generally this takes about 5, sometimes 10 minutes. Nick, I love when you throw the music on. So let's all take a few minutes to get this sketched out. I'll do it myself. And then in about 5, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it feels like it needs, we'll come back and we'll share some of our values and how this exercise felt. Does that sound good to everybody? Perfect. Okay. I'm going to go quiet for a second, but feel free to go inward and spend some time reflecting on this. Right. How's everyone doing? Yeah? Okay. I was slower than everyone else, even though I've done this activity before. Would anyone want to share sort of any one, maybe not everything, but just like one realization or one insight you had as you were working on this reflection activity? I'm happy to go first if it's helpful to break the ice too. I'll jump in. So one of the things that is sort of when I've done this activity in the past or seen others do it is there's things that are a bit obvious, right? Like gender or cultural background, but sometimes what can get lost is also how small values might come up that are more nuanced. So for example, neither of my parents went to college. And so I never thought of college or as academia as something that I needed to, like, I never saw it as something that was included necessarily in a fixed path or in a way that like I would experience or graduate. And for that reason, this is ironic given that I'm working with an educational institution, but I've never felt like I fit in with academics, you know? And I think there can be, for me, a bit of a resistance to, you know, not wanting, like sometimes getting a little bit, feeling out of place or like a fish out of water when I'm in a room with folks that have deep academic expertise, which is something that continues to be a part of my lived experience and lenses to this day, actually. So does anyone else want to share? I think you are on mute, or maybe.
Okay. I was trying to make things big. You know, I really kind of, and I think my teammates would tell you this too, although I live in academia, I very much do not operate as an academic. I operate as a deviant, and academia has a lot of structures of hierarchy. And part of the reason I'm, like Amy's like, yep. Part of the reason I'm able to kind of bust through those is I have all the credentials that align me with academia. I have PhD and a bunch of other letters after my name, and I have a title that sounds incredibly academic. I have an assistant vice chancellor and dean title, right? So I get a lot of differential, like, oh, but at the same time, I really struggle with the academia hierarchy culture. Because to me, the most important person is whoever is the knowledge holder or the change agent in the moment, right? And so that needs to be valued and moved. And frequently, I'm in a situation where I'm leveraging somebody else to be the change agent, but people are looking to me to do that work. And I think from my lens, I have this kind of love angst with academia in the world that we work in. So that's really valid, and I'm feeling it really today. And I think some of the things that I've experienced that inform that have to do with when I first thought I'd be a clinician, I had a notebook where I would write down everything that I thought that a clinician did that was amazing or that really sucked. And then when I thought I was shifting to academia, I mean, I actually had a journal on how to teach. Like, I actually thought if I'm going to teach, I need to learn how to teach, because I'm not a teacher. I'm a content expert. And I didn't realize how atypical that approach was. And I have to give Sheena Rogers, who was a visiting professor from Oxford, when I was a doctoral student, she taught a class on how to teach psychology. And it was a 1-credit course. Nobody had to take it. And the first thing we talked about, we spent like 2 hours talking about what is a syllabus. And I was like, oh, well, it's it. And she's like, is it? And we're all like, what? What do you mean? What do you mean, is it? It's 16 weeks and you plug everything in to get through the 16 weeks. And she said, so the syllabus is a schedule, not a learning tool, right? So she did this really elegant push and pull on us as young academics, and it really shaped how I thought about what my role was as an educator. And it shaped that I'm not just a content expert, but I actually need to understand pedagogy and teaching. And that the majority of us in academia, we teach how we learn, and we're the freaks and geeks, right? We went on and got a PhD. Somehow we thought this was really cool. And And so my favorite statement is when a professor goes, well, when I was a college student, I'm like, yeah, we're not normal, so you can't use yourself as the example, right? If we're all about the research methodology, we're the outliers to the classroom.
Yeah.
We're not the majority. We're not the bell curve. We are the outliers on a tail. So we cannot normalize our experiences in the classroom. That doesn't win me a lot of friends sometimes. But I also think it's allowed me to step out of what is defined as my roles. Comfort, I'm okay being in discomfort. And like when Jess and Amy signed on to be a part, and Brenda to be a part of the team, and I'm interviewing people, and they're like, "What are you doing? Is this an interview?" Brenda, you can tell the story that you thought you weren't going to get hired because we spent half an hour talking about data analytics and spreadsheets, and you're like, "I thought I was interviewing to be a career counselor." And Jess knows this. I interview people for who they could become, not the job that's in front.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was normal. And then I learned it wasn't. Like, most people are interviewing for the task work in front of them, not the growth or where the work might shift. So we get a lot of people, and this is where I see that we get stuck with diversity and equity inclusion, is where we're pegging people. I hired you to do X.
Right.
And so you live in X. And to me, X is the moment, not the outcome. Yeah. And so so that's a lot of my lens in how I don't like the moment's okay, but it's not where I want to be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing. And I think it's fascinating too that so much of you are on the same team. And so being able to actually articulate and unpack the way in which you're, what lens you're bringing to the table and your method is so interesting, and certainly can relate to some of that too as well. Does anyone else want to share just some of the thoughts or thought starters that have come to mind based on this exercise?
I don't mind sharing if you don't mind not being able to see me. Sorry. This is Brenda.
Hi, Brenda.
Hi. As I was listing all of mine, I realized that the two main things that seem to have developed are the fact that I come from a long line of very stubborn Midwesterners who very much believe that nobody is the boss of them and nobody can tell them what to do. Mm-hmm. And they're also, as a part of their community, my family has always been very active in volunteerism. So I grew up with that mantra that it was always our job to make our community better. And then I took those two things and I experienced some cancer when I was in high school, and was really lucky to have an experimental treatment and also watch a lot of friends go through that as I, of course, went into volunteerism in the cancer world and started working with cancer survivors, and just started kind of taking that whole contrary, devil's advocate attitude that I had growing up, where nobody can be the boss of me, and kind of moving it into, equity and rights. And well, why can't everybody in wheelchairs play on this playground? And why can't people who are experiencing cancer, still do the same things that everybody else can? And why can't people who have, gone through experiences, have allowances made for that and have their world still be accessible to them? And as anybody on my team can tell you, I am just the first person to start an argument about anything, because I don't really like it when people are the boss of me. So thank you, Justin and Elizabeth, for continuing to support me in that.
Oh, I love this. This is so much fun for me to learn about the way some of the folks on the team interact with one another. I love it. Thanks for sharing, Brenda.
Minnie, you'll definitely see how we all came together as we go through this. As I'm, there's a common theme of us probably in the disability and inclusion world in general, and certainly this team in particular on being comfortable with the uncertain and the change, and not, like Elizabeth said, not in the X and the now, but really living in what can be and how to get there. And listening to Elizabeth and Brenda, as well as you, Minnie, and sharing what struck you. I was thinking that initially my list started with some of those more obvious identities and relational. So kind of I'm the oldest child, and I'm a sister, and so on. And maybe being the oldest, certainly probably had a piece of me blazing my own trail a little bit. But also as you were getting into education focused, and I start to think that some of the other things that I thought about was really being rooted in a family where I did have that safety and security, and I come from a place of quite a bit of privilege, although being female, being one of less privilege, but really that kind of that foundational experience that I've inherited really allowed me to be in a safe place to do some of these things, kind of like Elizabeth's credentials. Mm-hmm. In that pushing the boundaries is maybe a little safer for me than it might be for others that maybe listed some different categories or identities and experiences. So,
yeah. Thank you everyone for sharing. This is so lovely, and I know we're a small group, but one of the things that I think can be really helpful, especially with interdisciplinary teams, or as you're starting to, a new person comes into the org, or working with a new stakeholder or set of students, is starting to find tools. And this is just one tool. I tend to use this lenses exercise simply because it's relatively, it's not kind of tethered to any type of synthesis. So if you do like a personality test, there's already bias baked into that. I'm a whatever ENFJ. So I think just speaking to lenses for me has always felt like one way that we can start to kind of unpack and understand the perspective within which we're bringing to the table. And when we're building diverse teams, when we're building teams that we're trying to, look to bigger systemic problems, having a way to hold one another accountable for when our lenses may be kind of coming up or showing up in a certain way, shape, or form is just, it might sound like table stakes. You guys are experts in this. I know you work in this space, but something like a foundational tool like this, and even making it really visual. When we used to be in the same location, which we're not anymore, my teams would put stuff up on the wall that's like, here's how you can help me grow as an individual, and acknowledging that we're all trying to tackle these large systemic issues, and acknowledging it starts with human beings, and human beings are imperfect. We all are. So again, we have 3 more exercises to get through, but I did want to just speak to the fact that first and foremost, I think there's truth to just understanding who's on the team and how do we come together as biased humans to support and shape the work we do together. So thank you for humoring me, and we'll keep going. I want to keep my eye on the clock too. Okay, cool. I think we still have some time. Okay, so we just did this. Great. So moving on. All right, so let's kind of move on to creating an inclusive process. This is where I tend to get most excited, as you all probably heard either from Jess's intro or if anyone was in the keynote I gave. I use a methodology in my process called co-design. It's how I've always structured my teams and my approach, and you can do a bunch of research. Co-design is also referred to as participatory design, but effectively what that means is that I'm never working alone. In fact, if anything, I'm teaching a process. So an example of that, and I'll share this here in a minute with one of the case studies I'll share, but is thinking about ways that I'm effectively evangelizing and teaching a process of creative problem solving to a much broader community of individuals. And if I've done my job properly, whoever I'm working with, young adults from this background, or people who are wheelchair bound, or whatever the audience is within which I'm trying to solve problems with, they're walking away with creative problem solving skills. And so they never need to work with me again. That's like my dream for every project, believe it or not. Sadly, there's so much inequity in this country. There's always projects to be done. So just to speak to this, like I showed this in the keynote, but like this is a very unfortunate outcome of when you don't have an inclusive team. I think it's a flippant, like kind of quirky example, but actually Snapchat, for example, launched and didn't work for people with dark skin tones for a good 2.5 years. And the reason is because nobody on their team had dark skin, which is speaks not only to the lack of inclusion, but also to how it has a direct impact on an everyday service and product that people were using. And so just to kind of speak to what this looks like when we think about building our teams, and then we'll do another short exercise. Everyone on this team probably knows this, but like I really makes me kind of like squeamish when you hear in the news right now, especially after George Floyd's death, around building diverse teams and hiring diverse teams. It's like, I think just a note on that, right? Like no one person is inherently diverse, and we have to be aware that like the context within which people are, if you are diverse, the inherent problem is actually with the context that you're being hired into rather than the framing. And again, I know most of the folks at Wisconsin know this, but I think it's important to frame as we think about co-creation and diversity. I shared this before. This is something I'm sure many of you have seen, the intersection of intersectionality, and kind of showing this framework that just helps us understand that intersectionality and diversity can mean many, many, many things. This wheel is even bigger, but I couldn't fit all of the stuff on the page without it not being too small. And then the last thing in the context of disabilities is that I think, again, I mentioned this as a recap, but just something I had mentioned in the keynote was that, and when we talk about diversity with the context of disability, equally as important is to make sure that we're not speaking to disability as a personal attribute, but as context dependent. And again, just to recap that, someone might be wheelchair bound, but if, they're, I use the example of like my brother's an audio engineer, so I'm always thinking about music. So, amazing at engineering audio. You actually have a profound ability in that context, and you may not have the ability to navigate through certain streets because they have a set of stairs, but that doesn't mean that you're inherently disabled. It means that that's the context within which it's harder for you to navigate. Again, I'm preaching to the choir, but just to frame that up. So an example of what co-design looks like in practice, I didn't have as much time in the keynote, so I'm going to just highlight some of my own work actually, and really give a illustration of what this can look and mean. So to take a step back and highlight this, the context of where innovation and design, it can be very ego-based. And when you think of Apple, for example, and you think of Steve Jobs, or what's his name? Jonathan Ives, he's like the guy who always has the black t-shirt and is sharing the newest and latest, greatest feature. It's all about him. It's not about the people that made it. It's not about the people that made that happen. And when we look at innovation in the context of advancing the fields of supporting those with disabilities, it's the same thing. We have to shift the narrative of whose story we're telling when we think about innovation and design. And so this was a project, I'm much younger, as you can tell. This was about 12 or 15 years ago. And I was working with Nike Foundation with the Girl Effect, which is a program focused on helping elevate the voices of young women all around the world. And I was brought in as a researcher and designer to design a leadership program for young women. I went in there and was so excited, I was young and learning, and I was really excited to build this program for these girls. But quickly realized that my presence was actually inherently a bit disruptive. And in addition, Beyonce and Oprah were their idols. I had really nothing to do with the value, right? And in addition, there was some really heavy-handed questions. And while I've done plenty of trauma-informed care work, we also need to be aware of the limitations we have when we're working with communities outside our own. So this was the inside of a question box. We had questions about the workshops, and these were the questions that the girls were putting in to the box. And so it wasn't a place where you could kind of come in and just build this creative spark without having to address the systemic traumas that were associated with young women. So we were trying to, and this was with a major design firm, major client, this wasn't this wasn't some kind of unstructured piece of work we were doing. And the big takeaway in this respect was the job of myself as a designer and researcher in the space was to elevate the voices already in the room. And this is Rose, who at the time was 18. I'm sure she's now 30, I don't know. But she was a natural born facilitator. And so what we ended up doing was more of a train the trainer model, where her and a bunch of other young women actually took charge in teaching the creative skills that we were looking to embed. And we were able to take a step back as facilitators and just make sure that they had the tools they needed to support leadership and teaching leadership and creative problem solving. And it worked. This was in Ethiopia. We were in Bangladesh. We went all over the world and effectively did this model where young women were able to sort of learn and teach these skills to their community and make it their own. And, it really wouldn't have been as effective if it came from me. But it took trial and error to realize that it was actually about co-designing that solution and being a catalyst or a spark and actually not having anything to do with the outcome. And so this is a piece of work written by a colleague or a good friend of mine, George I. And I would again, we're all designers, so just use designer. Think of yourself as a designer in this context. But when designers work on complex social issues, they're often enter situations with inherent power that's given to them. And power is restorative the more you give it away. I think this is like one of the most important things that I try to continue to think about. It goes back a little bit, Elizabeth, to what you were saying with, like, how do I start to look at the moment and what the power, who holds that power in that moment rather than making it all about you or someone else. This is a really wonderful graph that UNICEF has used. It's adapted from Roger Hart. I don't know, has anyone seen this, the ladder of participation? I give this to a lot of my teams and my students when they're going out and trying to work on a social innovation problem. It can be really easy to ultimately kind of, think you're bringing in a participatory approach, but ultimately actually tokenizing or decorating whatever it is. And so what I like about this graph is that it actually shows the different degrees of participation. And so at the bottom, we have obviously like the worst outcome would be manipulation. Sadly, we see this all the time. We see this in even in some respects in like some of the Nike campaigns, they show like a person winning the Olympics who has like, is might have limb differentiation or something like that. But a lot of times it's like used to kind of highlight the gear that they're selling and not actually tell the story of that human being or show them when they're not winning an Olympic gold medal, right? And so there's still a sort of an ableism associated with that, in that, like, only if they win are they a success, right? So there's something really important in looking at, like, where are you standing, and you can kind of go up that ladder. So tokenism, and then, informing, but not actually consulting. And then we get more into this space of like consulting, co-creation, partnership, and ownership. And so it's good to work in the space of consulting and co-creation, but it's best to actually give ownership back to the communities that you're looking to serve and have that be the end game for everything that we're doing. And I'm sure, again, everyone knows this, but this framework has helped me a lot in sharing that mindset with others in the world. Feel free to stop me with questions. Or I was
going to say, Minnie, I want to pause. There was a really powerful experience. Jess and I were at a conference for Disability In, which is for corporate businesses to be the facilitators of their own disability, equity, and inclusion, right? So it's like business to business type development, but facilitated through an organization with a disability first lens. And last year, the Microsoft marketing guy came out and said, we want to talk to you about the Super Bowl ad that we put out about the Xbox controller being accessible. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a video of it, Minnie, and it was really powerful because the marketing guy was like, yeah, we had all this slick idea. We were going to get some video of kids playing with the accessibility, and then we were going to make it like super sexy. And they ended up doing all of these kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of just focused conversations with the parents and the users, to kind of get a video to decide how they were going to market the accessible controller. Mm. And the marketing team got back together and said, we're going to let them just tell their story. Mm. This isn't about, we're going to tell a little bit about why we developed what we developed, but it's less important about why we developed and the impact of what it means for a youth to be on an equal playing field in a gaming environment or to access a gaming environment. So if you ever pull up that Super Bowl, it's the 2019 Super Bowl Xbox adaptive video. And it was really interesting, Jess. Do you remember, like, he showed, like, they had this whole workboard on how they were going to promote and market this tool. And it was like a very standardized marketing approach. And he starts off with, and this is what we were going to do. And this is what we ended up with. And it really moved to that context of ownership in that Microsoft had created a barrier to universal gaming by designing a tool that required opposable thumbs and multiple digits and the ability to hold a posture that none of us want to hold for 27 hours. And when I look at this, it's really powerful because I look at right now it's the women on this team. We really do strive to move to partnership and ownership, but I also catch myself a lot of times in that I feel like we call it a social tax on our students who are disenfranchised and marginalized. And we're like, oh, Jess, would you be on this committee? You'd be a great representative because you're a woman. And I think in higher education, we frequently assume we're not doing this. But I'll be honest with you, I think we live in 1 through 4. If you look at our marketing materials, I don't know if you remember the story of UW-Madison where they photoshopped in a Black gentleman.
Oh, man. Yeah.
And then he came out and went, I wasn't at that football game.
If that's not decoration, I don't know what is.
I mean, it was manipulation. They photoshopped him in and they decorated him and they tokenized him. And when he called them out on it, they had to recall millions of dollars because they had put that image on everything for their recruiting. They had to apologize. They had to pay him. They had to do a lot. And it's been an example of the ultimate decoration in what not to do at university marketing since. It's pretty entertaining. If you go anywhere, they go, oh, the UW-Madison example. And he was very verbal. He got right on social media and I would like to point out, I was not there. But I think in higher ed, we're terrible. We're terrible in our recruiting efforts about living in 1 through 4. We very rarely ask our students in consultation and co-creation what you need. Hey, Georgie, what do you need from us to be successful here? What do you need to thrive and belong and be resilient here? And I know Georgie teaches in our summer transition program, and we've really flipped that to be more focused on that reverse model. But I'm having a moment of consciousness looking at this ladder.
When I saw it, I thought, I realized to name the possible adverse outcomes. It was for me just to just name it. It's helpful. It's not like we're always going to be doing it, but yeah. Well, thank you for the reflections. Does anyone else have any builds or thoughts? Because I agree. It's really helpful to there's nothing wrong. I mean, sure, systemically we want to do better, but it's good to just start with acknowledgement, right? I think we all know that to some extent. Yeah. Awesome. I'm
going to pause. Amy, you're one of our quieter friends on the team. What are your thoughts when you see this with some of the work we do? Amy is an awesome quiet leader.
I don't see Amy's name. Oh, there's Amy.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, Amy.
I watched your keynote too. Thank you. What are my thoughts about this? Yeah, it's jarring to see the words manipulation and tokenism and decoration as part of inclusion, but it happens a lot in the time I've worked as a professional with people with disabilities. So, but to hear it or see it in writing, it just feels wrong. So to remember to acknowledge it, like you said, and move on. And I'd like to see a little more examples of what the co-creation and consulting and ownership and partnership would look like. But you've given a few too, but just to make sure, because it does feel like we do a lot of informing. That one's not so wrong, but to me feeling, but we do a lot of informing, but how do we get to that ownership and things like that?
Yeah, the examples. I'm happy to pull a few more if it's helpful. I have this is a week-long workshop I normally do. So for me, it was culling, but I'm always happy to adapt it. And since we have a small group, I'm happy to pull a few more examples from the longer deck of a few ways I've done this too, if that's helpful. All right. Let's do a slightly shorter reflection this time because I do want to touch on a couple of there's three activities, and I want to make sure we have time for them. So, and if we want to do some examples at the end, I'm happy to pull a couple more as well as sort of part of the Q&A. So this is just another short reflection. You can write this down if you want. This is number 2, which is how could you within your organization build a more of a co-creative approach? And so just to reflect and think about this, I'd love to hear a few ideas. Can write it down, can just share if you have some. Over here on the right, I have some inspiration. So a couple ways that I've done this in the past to your question about examples. One is to be thinking about sort of setting up a series of feedback, like, not, hey, can you be here because we need you to represent X, Y, or Z community, but rather actively creating feedback check-ins. That's really an important process for design. Co-creation sessions, which are effectively co-designing. So what I always say in the process of design is having a really good question can be the ticket to actually coming up with great answers. And so what I always try to do is when I'm working with youth and young adults is to say, it's not really my job to solve this problem. It's my job to frame the problem in a way that others can support a collective problem solving together. And framing the problem is actually very challenging at times. Third is immersion, a little less easy in the days of COVID, but and probably for you all, because you're more actively focused on this work, it's not quite as valuable, but for some people can be really a helpful way to think about this. And then fourth is one of my favorite things, which is creating an advisory board. And I mentioned in the keynote that I don't see the financial, often I say to my clients who might be investing, the foundations or the nonprofits, I'll say to them, my clients are actually the beneficiaries, and I want to build an advisory board where they're able to give feedback. And if they don't approve, like, we don't ship it, basically. And so setting up that power dynamic differently, I think, is a really important piece. So those are a few examples. If anyone has any ideas or thoughts, you're welcome to share. We probably only have like a minute or two to reflect because I want to get through everything before we wrap today. So yeah, maybe 2 minutes to think, and then feel free to share. Let's just share any sort of top of mind reflections or thoughts here, because I do want to move us along.
So this is Jess,
Hey,
and I'd be
Jess.
happy to, some of the things that came to mind in our work, especially around inclusive employment. There's more examples, but sometimes they're more hidden and hard to find, or they're still more rare than we would like to see of people with disabilities really working to their interest and potential out in the community. And so it is, I'm just struck by the nature of seeking feedback and continuous feedback, and thinking about how important it is to continue to be finding those different voices and people that are in different stages of their journey. And so kind of back to the ladder that we're moving further along, and it's not one person doing the bulk of that work or one family's experience, but also thinking about when we ask people to do things in advisory boards. I think your example is really interesting because they can be really valuable feedback. And also in my experience, I find that it's professionals paid to engage in that process and listen and present. And then the community or the end user is typically volunteering their time and and has there is some unequal power, and really thinking strategically about how those are framed in a way that is sharing that power and input and having many different voices is just continually a challenge. So this is an interesting framework that you're sharing.
I'm really grateful that you also, when I do more of a trauma-informed care workshop about how that applies to the design process, I do talk about like stipends and how we compensate people. And it's so true. There's a very and often situation where we sort of say, oh, thank you for, this will benefit you eventually, so we're going to ask you to give your opinion. But ultimately, that's thought leadership. That's information that we should be compensating people for. So I'm really happy that you brought it up, because I wouldn't have remembered to mention that. Thank you. Yeah. Any other builds or thoughts on this idea of how we can be more co-creative in our processes?
This is Georgianne. I'll just add, I think being more open-minded when there's meetings and such and there's an agenda, sometimes that focus is too focused on that agenda and moving it forward versus listening to others' opinions, etc.
Yeah, some flexibility. That's a really good point. The more that we can, there's something we do in the design process, which it's a tool. It's not the only tool, but it's like a how might we question. It's often referred to. So like, how might we solve this, or how might we explore this? And the intention behind that style of questioning is that it's intended to be a conversation starter. And so knowing that maybe while agendas are great, having some flexibility to open the dialogue up to a broader point of view and broader perspectives can be really interesting and important, I think, in some contexts. So that's a great point. Anything else before we talk a little bit more about feedback loops? I think that's the next topic. All right, cool. I think we're still tracking. I do want to get us done a little bit before 4 o'clock, so everyone has a chance to take a little breather. Cool. So measuring your impact, again, this isn't something that you all are probably familiar with, but there are some tools that I think are really helpful for us to be looking to with regards to inclusion and equity. So one of the things that I always encourage my clients and my partners to think about is, how are we actually embedding feedback mechanisms into what we create? Whether it's through technology, whether it's through a loop of, some sort of loop of dialogues that we're having, or even monetary, we get, like, when I work with clients, it's like, if we see X amount of, improvement, like, we'll tying some kind of monetary value to that, so that it actually can really put a stake in the ground that this is important, that we see this to have, real impact, and we're measuring it. And so these are some tools. These are all different. I'm just going to share a few that we use. So one is sort of this idea of your hypothesis or question. So what are you looking to learn? What is the evidence you need to gather in order to do that? How will you collect that data, and what do you plan to do with the data once you collect it, is one way. This is from a tool I helped build called the Circular Design Guide, which is actually focused on the sustainability of products. But I thought it was an interesting one, because we should also think about the sustainability of equity and impact in the same way. This I shared in the keynote. This is a monitoring checklist, which is more looking at like what possibilities could be adverse effects, and how do we continue to measure the safety or the transparency of what we're putting together. Transparency being a really big one, like what isn't working as well as what is working. And then this is just my own kind of framework I put together for many of my students that helps me, is just thinking about how do we tackle the who, what, when, where, why, how of whatever intervention we're looking to build, and being able to share and articulate those. So the questions that I encourage everyone to ask whenever we're thinking about innovation and design is these following 5 questions. So why this, why now? Being able to articulate a clear reason for the change you hope to see. Who, so there's an activity we do called stakeholder mapping. You guys may have a similar thing. I don't know how overlapping the design processes or not, but who will the solution affect? Who's invested? Who can support it? And moreover, who are the unintended? One of the things I mentioned in the keynote is like, sometimes there's unintended outcomes. So if you're adding something to benefit, say, a wheelchair user or somebody who might be hard of seeing, understanding like, are there other people that can actually be positively or negatively affected by these interventions? Going back to the thought of this might actually help people who are, I don't know, in another capacity needing some of the same affordances that we create. How we measure impact, what we're talking about. What are the design the inputs and activities to make this concept or idea a success? We sometimes forget that there's not going to be one silver bullet, and service and system design is often a series of different things working together to make something succeed. And so I often encourage folks in the innovation world, everyone's obsessed with the 3-minute pitch, like what is it, how's it work? But I think it's also important to show what is the scale of what we're making and what are all the moving pieces that inform it if we're actually going to measure impact. And when. And the timeline piece is obvious, like we all kind of think in terms of time. That's how reality is structured as far as we're all concerned. But actually thinking about the reason I bring time up, and I think it's really important, is that us as people who are building policies and programs, we have to make sure that there's designated owners who are going to take over after we're out of the picture. And one of the biggest problems with social innovation in the design space is we come in, we create an idea or an intervention based on our skills, and then we may assign an owner, but we may not give that owner the tools to actually continue to evolve the program or project or pilot or whatever it is we're building. And so making sure that our end beneficiaries are well equipped not only to be part of our research and our design process and our actual outcomes, but that we're actually transferring ownership and power over as well is, in my mind, like the best outcome for whatever we seek to create. And then where will this have an impact? And so thinking about the education system, we all have a very specific lens, but ultimately it can be really interesting to start to think about how is this setting students up for success outside of the academic environment, or how are we starting to look at and measure the impact of this in a much broader sense? And so I think for me, I'm sure you all are familiar with this. A lot of my students and a lot of my other folks at Growth are not, because they're not in academia. But I always encourage folks to build a theory of change. There's a lot of different frameworks and templates. I think just given the time, it might be beneficial. I think I would want to share maybe an example or two more. And since please let me know if anyone hasn't made a theory of change or doesn't know what a theory of change is. But the way that I generally structure this is working with the desired impact. So what is it that you want to create? And then what are the inputs, activities, outcomes, and measurement of that creation? So let me pause, because what I do have folks do sometimes is actually create a theory of change around a topic or an intervention that they would want to make. But I think I'm assuming that folks are relatively familiar with this process. Am I correct in that, or is anyone wanting to put this into action? Okay. All right, I think I'll skip over this one just because I think it would be nice to share maybe one or two more examples for folks. Okay, all right, let's skip over. All right. So, but you'll see the slides and you can pull any of these resources if y'all want. Cool. Awesome. And then the last thing I recommend folks do, and I mentioned this in the keynote, but just to think about who might disagree with what you're creating and why. Look at the possible adverse outcomes. And again, just in the name of time, I'll move through this, but you can do this all on your own as well and sort of reflect on like, what might the negative outcome be of what we're creating as well. Okay. One more activity, and then I'll pop open just a couple more examples based on the request, just to see a few more examples of this in action. So, learning from mistakes. I showed this already in the keynote, so I won't go over it, but this is National Geographic acknowledging that they've had historically racist coverage for 100 years, authoring a piece in their own magazine, acknowledging that. And so the last activity that I thought we could do as a group, and then I'll pop open a few more examples to inspire folks, is kind of building our own Hippocratic Oath. And so the reason I do this is that we see the medical industry, for example, has a set of rules as to how to measure impact or how to work. And for example, my industry in design and innovation has literally nothing. And every industry is a little different, and we all have different kind of rules around how we structure things. So one thing that I encourage all of the teams that are starting on initiatives around social impact, equity, inclusion is to create their own set of guidelines which can ultimately inform and serve you as sort of your moral compass as you're moving through your process, to avoid things like Elizabeth shared, which is like these tokenistic or manipulative efforts. And so this is something that my students did. And this is one I pulled because I just kind of loved it. It's so simple, and it's just 4 rules. And so they put this together, Larica and Janai, and they said, number 1, I will always ask the question, who am I working for? I will, to the best of my ability, work with diverse teams to counteract my own biases and assumptions. I will consider the full context within which I'm designing. I understand that things exist within a framework of a larger system, and I will anticipate my work will outlive my deadline and make an effort to plan accordingly. I just thought, that's it. Like, that's great. And so I would love to pause and see if there's anything that you all think should exist on your Hippocratic Oath for you, Will, or if anyone's in a different word, feel free to share as well.
I challenge Georgie because she challenges me all the time. And just a story between Georgie and I hired her, and I was like, oh, I really like people who challenge me. And I think on day 2, she walked in flailing 4 pieces of paper and said, why do we do this? It doesn't help the students. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? I was like, that's a great question. Let's take it to the team. And I just kind of sat back, and Georgie, I think we changed that within a 2-week period.
Yeah, everyone had to get a little used to it. It was just a redundant process. And it's like, you're doing this 4 times.
Well, and I think Georgie appropriately asked, who are we doing this for? Right? Yeah. Is it serving the student, or is it serving us? And why would we make the student do something because it's more convenient for us?
Yes. Yeah. So I would add to the oath, I will always try not to get in the way of those that are already doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll defer to the experts, or I'll defer to those that know the space better than I do.
And again, just basically that's not telling someone that they can't do it. If they're already doing it, don't be getting in their way. And if they're doing, too many people are told they can't do something, and then they just give up.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. And I'd encourage you all, to write your principles out, and they may exist. I might be completely like giving you input.
I'm looking at Jess, and she's making a note. I think this will be a really fun team activity to do for us. I feel very privileged right now, Minnie. I feel like we're getting to kind of think about some things for our team to design.
I hope so. I think that's the name of the talk, capacity building for teams. So yeah. I hope we're delivering on that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel very spoiled right now. Jess?
It does. It feels like our own, one-on-one with Minnie. Although I should mention that there are people watching on the main screen and in the main chat as well. So hi, all of you. We just get the actual interactive part with Minnie. And Elizabeth totally knows me because this whole time I've been fitting these suggestions into some of our team plans as we're doing some of our strategic planning and how to frame it. And one conversation that I think you've been touching on, Minnie, and has been in my mind as we've been talking from a racial justice standpoint and an anti-racist, and then the intersection with disability, is around the precision of language, and not only how powerful language is from being inclusive and creating that culture or recognizing the community, but I think being really precise when we're working on a design, what folks are we speaking to? So not just kind of who, but being really clear, are we talking about a particular type of disability and experience, a type of employment, a type of service, and so on. Because sometimes we get too big and broad in the inclusion, and then we're not, what is it, designed for, solve for one and extend to many.
Yeah. I gave the example in the keynote, like that, universal inclusive design is not universal design. And like I use the cockpit as the example, which is a totally like a trope at this point. Like, of course it's not, but it can be easy at times to forget that we need to be thoughtful about the nuance, depending on who we're working with and who we're collaborating with too. That's a great point. Yeah. Well, this is great. And you all have these tools. Again, my goal is really to just be a facilitator and ultimately let everyone kind of take ownership. As I say to my students, I'm like, I'm just putting tools in your toolbox. Like, you're the one that's in charge of how and what this looks like. Just to kind of, I think, wrap us up. And then I'm happy in the last few minutes to just share, maybe in the last like 5 minutes, I can give one more case study that I think highlights another example of co-creation, because it does help to see it in action. These are some folks who I put links to all of them in the document, which I'll share with everybody. These are some people who are doing some amazing work in this space around innovation and inclusion, who I highly recommend checking out. Liz Jackson focuses on innovation and design in the world of disability. Antoinette Carroll focuses on inclusion and design in the world of anti-racism and equity. She calls the team she leads equity designers, which is great. And everyone else in this group is fantastic. So the conversation doesn't stop with me. I'm just one of many, many, many practitioners who are exploring and trying to make this a more ubiquitous and kind of scaled practice. So yeah, definitely check these folks out. Put links to some of their really wonderful pieces they've all put together here. Yeah, and thank you all for being so present and engaged. It's a joy to collaborate with everyone on this call. So thanks for taking the time, and happy to open a case study up, but just wanted to see if there's any other questions before I pop that open. All right, none? Helpful to share that before we jump off? We have a little more time. All right, cool. Bear with me while I poke around my computer really quickly. Just gonna grab the case study. So this case study I'm going to share with you all as another example of designing for inclusion and co-creation is with, this is with youth, system-involved youth. And the goal of this project was actually to help our young people, or the young people that we were working with, better feel more aware of what the law was. And when we did the research with these young people, the realization we had around this was it actually wasn't about teaching young people the law. It was about helping them learn what their rights are, and in order to feel like they understand and appreciate kind of what the legal indicators are. So I'm just pulling it up. It'll be 1 second here because I've got a million things up. But I think it'll show a little bit about how we structured the entire engagement. This was over the course of 1.5 years. So, change doesn't come quickly, but it just gives a couple of quick last examples before we break today. So I think I have it up. And okay, here it is. And then I'm going to screen share one more time. And here you go. All right, can you see my screen again? Okay, great. So super, super quick. I'm just going to give you like the quickest overview of one more project. Again, I know we're a bit limited on time, but I just thought it would be helpful to see a couple of pieces of this work in practice. So again, this was a program intended to help transitional age youth focus on understanding their rights. And just a few, I'm going to skip over the logistics because it was an important project for a lot of reasons. And we had a lot of statistics to back that up. And just to highlight what and where and how we brought this to life. I'm just trying to get my screen out of the way. Can you guys see? looks like you can't see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. There we go. Okay, so a couple things that we did that were, I think, really helpful in the process is everyone on the team did do deep trauma-informed care training, which I know many of the folks have done on your team, but I do think it's really, as I mentioned in the keynote, really important that everyone is understanding what privilege looks like. And one example is like a youth in custody was like, well, you get to go home to your bed tonight and I don't. And so I think building a better understanding of what deep empathy actually looks like and trauma-informed care, I think, was a really important piece of the work. As well as the sort of history and healing of the community we were serving. And one thing that can often get overlooked, to your point earlier, was that, you know, we can actually end up forgetting that there's so many experts that we're able to lean on and rely on. So we built an arsenal of about 25 experts that we worked with in this topic, who could help educate the entire team on school to prison pipeline, understanding exactly why and how some of the sort of systemic problems that end up unfairly targeting Black and Brown youth in our country, and inherently making them system involved. And again, many of the people on our team had experience or lived experience that would help them understand that. But for myself, as a person who has historically not been system involved, it was really important that I wasn't relying on my own lived experience or my own short conversation with someone to inform that. So that was where the don't learn off the backs of others thing came from. Yeah. So this was my client, Cassidy Higgins, and she was like, one of the things we say is, you know, if you learn off the backs of others, then you're not actually doing your own work. And so this is where we brought in a group. So these were transitional age youth leaders, and these young women were actually experts on the topic, and had already graduated from programs that were facilitated by our client. Our client's name, by the way, was Fresh Lifelines for Youth. That was the name of the organization, FLY. And so they worked, which I love it, so great. And so they were our advisors. And so these are folks that were what we refer to as near peers. They were a little bit outside of the exact group that we were looking to focus on, but had that lived experience, and they were our stakeholders. And so we would share the information with them and they would give us feedback. And I also want to stress, I can't stress enough the importance of working with near peers when you're focused on a certain community and learning from people who are not actively your end beneficiary in that user, but have the lived experience and are just beyond whatever it is. Like that was a huge part, that's a huge part of my practice as well. We do a lot of work around building confidence, because a lot of folks, you can't just be like, you're going to come co-design with us. Like you have to make sure that these young people have the creative confidence to join you. And so we put together a lot of exercises intended to build their creative confidence. And one of the things I do with every student group I work with is we start with talking about what are the skills that I can bring to the table. So they're all starting with acknowledging that they have skills. They're walking into the room with a set of skills. What skills do I want to learn? And what are some agreements we have as a group? So again, just understanding and acknowledging that you are bringing value just as you are. And we don't tell young people that enough. We're always like, they're so used to sitting in front of an educator. So again, simple nuances. And yeah, so just a couple more slides and then, you know, hopefully this is helpful context. When we would co-design, we would also talk to them about our process. So when they would come up with an idea, the week I would go home and I would like think about what they said and I'd try to design for them. Like I was, you know, this like, you know, little turning straw into gold, and then coming back and being like, did you like what I made? And so, but we would always do a visualization of how we got to the idea. And so I would take the Post-its that kids would contribute, put them on a board and say, here's what you said, here's what I made in response to that. What are your thoughts? And one of the young people had said, like, that's my idea. That's my Post-it. Like you saved it. And just this small detail of showing that we took their thoughts so seriously, it was incredibly valuable for these young people. Our ideas and concepts look something like this. So this is kind of what we would put together in order to inspire kind of the idea. So just high enough fidelity that they can see like the idea, but not so high fidelity that it feels like we've sort of taken away their opportunity to give feedback. We want to keep it low fidelity enough. And I can put these slides as well into the presentation. It's just an hour and a half is not long enough to get through everything. And then last but not least, I'll just share this, and then I'm happy to give everyone a few minutes to break. But we also even co-designed things like the messaging and the branding. So we were trying to figure out what to name this program, and we couldn't tell if we wanted it to be like really slick, like legal street smarts to succeed, or, you know, get in the game, or, you know, we didn't know quite what to say in terms of the framing. And so we took 5 very different value props to the students and said, which do you all like? And we were so glad we did, because one of them was more about like, take to the streets and fight for your rights. And they're like, we hate that. We hate that branding. We don't like that at all. Like, that's what's going to get us arrested if we go back out there and like say this stuff. And what they said was, when they put those young men that I was working with in this session in particular, and they were like, when I put a suit on, I feel respected, and I want this guide and this street law around my rights to feel just like that suit I put on. And so we brought a brand association, and we said, okay, this is going to be the James Bond, or like The Rock, I think, was our like brand ambassador. And so you can see the materials to the right are really like elegant and pretty beautiful. And that was inspired by our young people. This was the mood board. As designers, we make mood boards all the time. This was the mood board we made. And ultimately, yeah, we measured, we launched a pilot, we measured the impact, we put everything on like Instagram and in places they would be likely to find it. And this is what we built, which was a pretty refined, you know, youth inspired. This is like the branding they liked. And it was basically an 8 series, like an 8 parts of the curriculum, each focused on a different part of learning their rights. And we called it Stay Fly, I think was the name of it, Legal Street Smarts to Succeed. And then each section had to do with a different aspect of knowing their rights, the justice system, et cetera. And so I'll happily put this case study in as well. But I think this shows how we really, nothing in this was my voice. The only thing that was my voice was like, or the only thing that I contributed was the literal tangible skills to build these tools in order to hopefully build a deeper awareness of what these young people needed to know in order to thrive. So just in time, I'm just finished sharing. So anyway, I want to give everyone a few minutes to you know, get some water and join the closeout, but hope that example, that rogue example I threw in, helps to frame some ways you can apply this in your own work.
Thank you, Minnie.
Yeah. Thanks for appreciating the improv at the end.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. Thank you for sharing that extra example. Looks like lots of thanks. And let's take, as we transition, let's take about 5 minutes for any bio breaks and transitions that are necessary. And then Dr. Crowley will be giving our day 1 closing at 4 p.m. Thank you, Minnie. Thank you for your expertise and time.
With pleasure. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Minnie. I was watching, so I was observing.